And I do think it's going to have a corrosive effect with some floating voters, because the details of this case are pretty shabby. It's going to be alleged, of course, that Trump had a fling with Stormy Daniels while Melania was recovering from giving birth to their son. So it was an extramarital affair, and they're going to raise a second affair with a former Playmate of the Year, Karen McDougal, that also took place, it's alleged, while Trump was married to Melania, to try and show a pattern of behavior, because she was also paid off, it is alleged, to the tune of $150,000.
Okay.
And that's a much longer term affair. That's not just a one night stand, if you like. It's a months long affair. So these details are all going to come out, and there are tapes of Trump discussing some of the aspects of these cases that will, I'm pretty sure, grab a lot of attention in the coming weeks.
Let's head over to the US, where the House of Representatives has just convened to vote on a $95 billion package for Ukraine and Israel, as well as other allies. The vote comes after months of delay and strong opposition from pro-Trump Republicans. Sarah Baxter is the director of the Mary Colvin Center in international reporting, and she joins us now. Sarah, thanks for giving us your time.
Thanks, Alexis.
Sarah, can you tell us the latest? I know that Congress has just convened, but this vote wasn't even easy to get to the vote stage.
Absolutely not. And they're holding this vote in Congress not a moment too soon, really, because Ukraine desperately needs this package of about $61 billion in aid. As we heard on the news, that's about £50 billion. And it has been held up for months, really on the basis of ideological opposition from a small band of hard right-wing MAGA enthusiasts, that's Make America Great Again enthusiasts, fanatics for Donald Trump, who has never been a friend of Ukraine's, has always been more friendly to Vladimir Putin and Russia. So it's a hugely significant moment that this vote is going through at all, and it comes after a big change of heart by the Republican Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, and it may yet cost him his job.
And how do we see it going? I'm assuming that the MAGA Republicans in Congress are still going to vote it down. They object to America, if you like, being the country that has to pay the big bucks. They feel that other countries, particularly in Europe, are not pulling their own weight by paying into things like NATO. So I'm assuming that they'll still vote against this amount of money being sent over to Ukraine and Israel.
Yes, the MAGA oppositionists will still vote against it. In fact, over 90 Republicans, actually it wasn't all Republicans, but quite a lot of people, there were 90 opposition votes to even tabling this bill yesterday. And so, yes, there'll be opposition within the Republican Party. But the point about this bill is it's reaching the floor with bipartisan support. Overwhelmingly, the Democrats will vote in favor, and those combined votes will see this aid package to Ukraine and a package of aid to Israel passed today. And it's very, very important. It appears that Mike Johnson, the Republican House Speaker, who saw Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago only a few days ago, has decided to put his job on the line over this, because he's a very strong evangelical Christian, and he's been meeting with evangelical Christians from Ukraine who've been telling him how much this help is needed. He's also a Speaker of the House, probably privy to a lot more US intelligence information than you or I, and is, very concerned that Ukraine might lose the war without this help. So I think he's been moved as a Christian, as a fundamentalist Christian himself, to help Ukraine, because he's, having prevaricated and stonewalled for months, he's suddenly had quite a passionate change of heart.
Sarah, before we go, can you also give us the latest on Donald Trump's trial? We believe that a jury is now in place after, I think, they whittled it down from 90 people all the way down to 12. What do we know so far about the trial and the jury?
Well, first of all, they've selected a jury much quicker than we imagined.
Oh,
At one point, we were talking about it was going to take a couple of weeks to find a jury because there'd be so many objections, etc. But the jurors have got through. Nonetheless, a couple of jurors have stepped down. One because they obviously lied about something on their form, and another because they were afraid of retaliation should information come out that they are a juror, which of course is the sort of thing that makes juries afraid to be on mobster trials. So that was interesting. But anyway, it looks like it's going to start pretty soon. And I think the Judge Merchant, who doesn't seem to have been any particular friend of Donald Trump, who's attacked him mercilessly in personal terms, I should say, wants to get on with it. He's not going to take any nonsense delaying tactics from Trump's lawyers. On the other hand, some people are acting as if this case has been won already, and it is not in the bag. It's quite an unusual case. We probably don't have time to go through all the ins and outs now, but I'd say there's only a 50-50 chance of conviction.
but Sarah, just briefly before we go, though, isn't the case for Donald Trump that it's almost a win-win for him? If he's absolved of any wrongdoing, then he can say, well, look, I was protesting my innocence all along, and said that this was a witch hunt focused on politically causing a disadvantage and putting him out of the campaign trail and sticking him in a court when there's actually nothing to see here. So if he walks out of the courthouse as a free man, an innocent man, he's got a win. And also, if it goes the other way, he still is able to play the martyr card for his supporters who think that he's still being politically prosecuted to prevent him from well, they can't even prevent him. Even I think he can run even if he can't even vote for himself for being in prison. He can still run and be president. But for Donald Trump, it's a win-win, is it not?
Yeah. Well, it certainly Democrats are worried that he's going to use the courtroom as a stage for proclaiming. I mean, I don't think he's going to go on the stand. He says he'd like to, but that's yet to be determined. Let's see about that. Certainly a very colourful case. As you mentioned, Stormy Daniels, the adult porn star, is going to be giving testimony. Michael Cohen, Donald Trump's chief fixer turned very harsh critic, is going to be on the stand. It's going to be fascinating to watch. But Donald Trump's also going to be scrutinised in court. He won't have it all his own way. He is going to be treated like an ordinary defendant. Obviously, he's nothing of the sort, and he will be able to make statements coming in and out of the courtroom. But in court, he is going to have to sit and listen if the judge tells him to. So he's not fully in control of the situation. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily a win. I think Donald Trump would rather it was not happening and that he was out campaigning in swing states, but he's very good at using any publicity to his advantage. So it's not necessarily as career-ending as, let's face it, it would be for any other politician.
Zelensky says America's $60 billion aid package could save thousands of lives in his country. The US House of Representatives finally approved a package to pay for arms to fight the Russians on Saturday, 6 months after they began debating it. Caitlin Dornbos is the Washington reporter at the New York Post and told us this had been a political marathon.
It's happened finally. It was a long way, right? It took 6 months. President Biden put this forward 6 months ago in October. And now it's gone through several iterations, but finally we have it passed by the House. It's now going to go to the Senate on Tuesday, but that should be a really easy way through because the Senate has already passed a similar measure. House put a couple of little tweaks on it. Now it will be on Biden's desk on Tuesday, and it will be, I'm sure there will be aid in Ukrainian hands by the end of the week.
And why? Because there's a relatively strong Republican opposition to this. Is it the connection with Israel? Because there's been funding to Israel at the same time as funding to Ukraine in this measure. Is that the thing that's got it over the line? What's changed?
Gosh, and my analysis of this has even changed since seeing the breakdown in voting. It came out yesterday. The votes came out. 112 Republicans had voted down the Ukraine aid package. So I should back up. It had been one big package, right, altogether. Pieces for Israel, Ukraine, China, other aspects there. What they had to do to get this passed was break it into 4 different bills and have everybody vote on each individual bill for aid. 112 Republicans voted against it. That was higher than I would have estimated. So I was actually surprised, and I think having everybody kind of put their name to the vote, as far as you are voting for something, you can't say that you're voting for another thing by casting that. I think that's a wake up call to see where the sentiment is, even in the United States. That said, it still passed with a majority, and it was a small glimpse of bipartisanship that we just don't see anymore.
Yeah, and will this cost the speaker's job? Because Mike Johnson, he was very against this stuff, wasn't he? I mean, Mike Johnson was not pro-Ukrainian aid. Now he's been the person credited with getting this through. Is that good for him? That a sign of, as you say, bipartisan statesmanship, or is it a sign that there'll be people waiting to kick him in the shins as soon as he leaves the building?
He said something interesting before putting the vote up on Friday. He said that if he was worried about one person tanking his entire speakership, he wouldn't be able to get anything done. And while it's true under this rule in the House that it only takes one member to put forward a petition to get the speaker out of the House to put it up for a vote, I think the Republicans were so frazzled over the last way they handled that with the last Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. Took more than 2 weeks to get a speaker elected. And during that time, they can't get anything done. I hope and I think that they have learned their lesson, but the future's unclear. And we'll see.
And I guess the question is, and this is an important question for Ukraine, because this has taken 6 months, and to a certain extent, 6 months is a massive problem for them, and they're struggling with the war, and the delay has not helped this. Is that what's the political reaction to this? Because there are some Republicans and there are some people on the right, led by the Post as well, saying we've got to support these people, we have to help the Ukrainians. But there's a big group of people who say no, possibly led by Donald Trump, stop wasting American money on foreign soil, and presumably we're going to see some reaction to this, and that's from the Republican side, and that's going to be crucial for the election and for a potential presidency.
Yes, you're really seeing this fracture right within the Republican Party. It's Donald Trump's influence and those who are purist, following whatever Donald Trump wants, and people who are Republicans who support Donald Trump. That's the breakdown that you're really seeing happening in this party this year. And it's troubling to people who are in the Beltway here in DC and are worried about the party, because we've always kind of been a two-party system. That's just the way it has turned out for American democracy. So we'll see. I mean, does it work? I've never seen a party in my lifetime wrangle with its health like it is right now.
And will moderate Republicans just hold their nose and vote Trump? That's presumably the question, isn't it? That you might have a person who doesn't necessarily stand for all your values in terms of his own behavior, in terms of his views on certain things where he tries to appease the evangelicals, things like Ukraine, foreign policy. The question is, does that all amount to so much Republicans can't vote for him? Or actually will they say, you know what, we're Republicans, he's a Republican candidate, we'd vote for whoever?
There are so many ways this year could turn out, because I talk to some Republicans, and yes, absolutely, it's like I would rather not it be Trump, but better Trump than Biden. But there are a lot of different issues on the ballot this year, abortion being one of them, foreign policy being other issues. Israel has brought in new criticism to Biden's leadership as well. So there's a lot of factors at play right there. I think that there will be more nose holding, if you will, and voting for Donald Trump than there will be Republicans voting for Biden. But I still think Biden stands a strong chance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, it's one of those policies here that points to the fractures you're talking about. Kelly, really interesting as ever. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, the prosecution in Donald Trump's hush money case has claimed that the former president directed a criminal scheme to corrupt the 2016 election. The prosecution at the court in New York painted a picture of an elaborate conspiracy between Trump, Michael Cohen, his former lawyer and personal fixer, and David Pecker, the publisher of a gossip magazine, to bury stories that might derail Trump's ultimately successful campaign against Hillary Clinton. Well, in court, Trump listened without expressing emotion as he was accused of falsifying business records to pay the porn star Stormy Daniels to cover up an alleged affair. But outside the courthouse, he had plenty to say.
On Letitia James, the money was put up, it's $175 million, and I don't think she's complaining about me for the first time ever. She's complaining about the company, but why would she be doing that when I put up the money? So I just want you to know that that's taking place in front of an extremely crazed judge who's the most overturned judge in New York State. He was overturned 4 or 5 times on that case alone. That's, you know who it is. I don't have to mention names. I want to be nice. I want to be very nice. But a thing like that, and a thing like what's going on right here should never be happening. It's a very, very sad day in America, I can tell you that. Thank you very much.
Well, David Charter is assistant US editor of The Times. Hello, David.
Good evening, Carol, from Washington, D.C.
Well, good to have you with us. It's been quite an important day in court, hasn't it? Tell us what's been going on.
Well, an important and historic day. Never before has an American president or a former American president sat there listening to the opening of a criminal trial against him. And we heard quite succinctly, just 45 minutes from the prosecution, how they're going to conduct this case and why they made it a serious felony charge rather than the usual lower level charge for falsifying business records, which would have been a misdemeanor that wouldn't have carried prison time. But the felony charges, 34 charges of falsifying business records, do carry up to 4 years in prison. And the serious aspect that elevates it is not only did President Trump allegedly cook the books to disguise payments to Stormy Daniels via his lawyer, Michael Cohen, but this was part of a criminal conspiracy to influence the outcome of the 2016 election. And there's been a lot of discussion about the context of the payments to Daniels, because they came just days after the release of an audio tape on which Trump, years earlier actually, was describing to an actor his seduction techniques and how he grabs women exactly. Probably familiar to many listeners, the exact terms that he used. And that tape, while it won't be played in court, the transcript of that has already been read out once by the prosecutor to say that Trump's campaign was in terrible trouble. This earthquake had just gone on under it, and that led them to scramble to pay $130,000 to keep Stormy Daniels quiet on her claims of an affair, which Trump denies, which in the view of the prosecutor, would have finished off Trump's attempt to become president in the first place during the 2016 campaign. So it's an election interference case that's being built against Trump. And we then had the opening statement of his defense, which is basically that he's 100% innocent. He did not have an affair with Stormy Daniels. This was a malicious accusation designed to embarrass him and his family and his wife. And moreover, Trump knew nothing of these payments. There were checks many checks were signed over to Michael Cohen, the lawyer, which the prosecution says is reimbursement. But Trump says he just, as the head of his organization, he signed all the checks thinking that they were just for legal services, which Michael Cohen provided, because that was his job. And he knew nothing about any scheme, hush money scheme to pay off an adult actress.
And Trump himself, Donald Trump, has been there in court. I mean, he's expected to be there every day, I think, of this trial. And it could go on for weeks, couldn't it? It may not ultimately prevent him from fighting the next election, but it's certainly having a huge impact on his campaign, isn't it?
I think it is. And not all of it negative, because, of course, he uses it to the max to try and motivate voters in his favor for showing, saying that the Biden administration is behind all this. It's a witch hunt, and it's designed to prevent his return to the White House. But for example, this Thursday, the Supreme Court, just down the road from me in Washington, D.C., is going to be hearing arguments about whether a president has immunity from prosecution, which has a bearing on at least two of his other criminal cases for trying to overturn the results of the election while he was still president, of course, but after he lost to Joe Biden. And Trump says, well, I'll be stuck in court here when I'd much rather be in the Supreme Court hearing those arguments. So that's just one of many instances where he's restricted in what he can do, because he is required to be in this New York courtroom in Manhattan. And it's said that it could go on for 2 months, which is really an extraordinary chunk of time while the candidates are known. We know it's going to be Trump against Biden. So it really is time to start campaigning. And Biden is campaigning. Biden spent 3 days in Pennsylvania last week ahead of the Pennsylvania primaries, which are tomorrow night.
And David, just briefly, so far, Donald Trump's prospects don't seem to have been harmed by this or those myriad of other cases which you touched on there. But if, as you say, this continues for perhaps another 2 months, do you think it is likely to lead to a shift? So far, most of the polls seem to suggest he's got still a small but pretty solid lead over Joe Biden, especially in some of those key swing states.
I think it will have an effect on the swing voters who are so important. Clearly, Trump has millions of supporters, most of whom probably get their news from news sources which in America are very favorable to Trump. You only had to watch some of the conservative news media today to see the way it was presented as an outrage, that Donald Trump was absolutely correct to be angry and sounding off about this prosecution that's brought by a Democrat, an elected Democrat district attorney and a judge who had donated to Biden's campaign, etc., etc. And so it is seen by people firmly in the Trump camp as highly partisan and as a witch hunt. However, the election is being fought for the votes of those people in the middle who really haven't made up their mind. Perhaps they don't really like Trump or Biden, but they want to use their right to vote. And I do think it's going to have a corrosive effect with some floating voters, because the details of this case are pretty shabby. It's going to be alleged, of course, that Trump had a fling with Stormy Daniels while Melania was recovering from giving birth to their son. So it was an extramarital affair, and they're going to raise a second affair with a former Playmate of the Year, Karen McDougal, that also took place, it's alleged, while Trump was married to Melania, to try and show a pattern of behavior, because she was also paid off, it is alleged, to the tune of $150,000.
Okay.
And that's a much longer term affair. That's not just a one night stand, if you like. It's a months long affair. So these details are all going to come out, and there are tapes of Trump discussing some of the aspects of these cases that will, I'm pretty sure, grab a lot of attention in the coming weeks.
David Charter, Assistant US Editor of The Times. Fascinating stuff. Really good to have you with us. Thank you so much.
We've become a bit blasé about Donald Trump's endless court battles. Well, his latest court appearance was significant enough to break through our feelings of same old, same old. The former and perhaps future president of the United States appeared in court in New York to hear opening arguments in his criminal trial, the first time that's ever happened to a president. Prosecutors said he committed election fraud, pure and simple. Philip Crowther is AP's international correspondent. He was in court.
Well, it was a very short day in court, actually, just a few hours because of the Passover holiday, but it did give us the time to hear those two opening statements. First of all, from the prosecutors and then from Donald Trump's defense team. And essentially what it gave us is the roadmaps, if you will, from the two sides as to how they're going to describe what Donald Trump did or did not do. From the prosecutors, a very clear tale of a man who not only falsified documents in their view, but did so with the clear goal to illegally influence the 2016 presidential election. Now, Donald Trump's defense team says, first of all, that hush money payments are not illegal. That is true. That influencing an election is not illegal either. They're right there too. But the combination of those two, they will have to convince those 12 members of the jury that that was something that was not illegal. It's going to be a fascinating up to 2 weeks probably of this trial altogether.
And presumably the prosecution, by pitching it as hard as this, is trying to sort of either subconsciously or consciously link it to other concerns that exist about Donald Trump. He doesn't respect the electoral process. The January 6th thing that followed 4 years later, they're trying to paint a picture. Presumably when I read the statement, it felt like they're trying to say, this is not someone just a bit embarrassed about an affair. This is someone who doesn't respect the sanctity of an election.
Yeah, and they're trying to make it clear that he did so consciously because, again, there is that difference of views from the two sides. The prosecution believes that he did this willfully, that it was part of a conspiracy to corrupt the election. The defense, though, Donald Trump's lawyers, they say that, first of all, he didn't really know he was involved in any kind of election interference, that these were deals made by his lawyer, his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, who will be a witness as well, and that Donald Trump wasn't all that involved. So that is really something that we saw from the prosecution, was to paint a picture of a former president, or in this case, somebody who was running for the presidency, who was somebody who was willing to interfere in the electoral process. Now, the prosecutors did not talk about the other criminal cases, but they are still trying to paint a picture that is much more dangerous to the former president than just somebody who was willing to falsify records.
My favourite detail in the case is the fact that the former publisher of the National Enquirer is called David Pecker. And he's kind of a figure in this because the prosecution's case is that he's sat down with Trump and regularly looked at stories to buy and therefore bury. Yeah,
it's a catch and kill scheme, as it is called. Essentially what the publisher of the National Enquirer, this is a tabloid full of scandalous stories, many of them false here in the United States. What he is alleged to have done is to have sat down not just with Donald Trump, but also with his former lawyer and fixer, Michael Cohen, and came up with this idea that he was willing to essentially pay for stories to go away that otherwise he might publish. Essentially a big deal made with the very conscious effort and the very conscious goal of getting Donald Trump elected and not having negative stories about his private life having an influence on his chances of being elected. A mastermind of sorts is how the prosecution is painting Donald Trump and his lawyer and the publisher of the National Enquirer as well. Again, the defense says that essentially nobody really knew what they were doing.
That's an interesting defense. You mentioned this is all about electability. What this boils down to, I suppose, Philip, is he may well be found guilty. He probably won't go to prison, and a large number of people in America will vote for him nonetheless. I guess the question will be, is there enough in this to put off enough people that it ruins his chances of election? That's the $1 million question that no one fully understands the answer to yet, do they?
No, and that is something that the former president is saying pretty much twice a day, essentially, because he speaks to the cameras when he enters the courtroom in the hallway outside the courtroom, and he speaks to them usually again when he exits the courtroom. He essentially says that this is a political case, that the whole goal of this is to hurt his chances of becoming president again, and that this is all orchestrated by the Biden administration. This is Donald Trump's point of view. Now, I don't know whether necessarily this case itself and a possible guilty verdict would have that really damaging impact on Donald Trump's campaign. There is something else that might hurt him more, and that is that we're looking at up to 2 months of this criminal case going on in this lower Manhattan courthouse. Witness testimony, including from former porn star Stormy Daniels about Donald Trump's private life. She says she had sex with Donald Trump. He says there was never a relationship. There might be some details that could be revealed in court for not all of us to see or hear because there are no cameras in the courtroom, but those sentences will still come to light. So things could get a little bit embarrassing for the former president, not just when it comes to revelations about his private life, but also revelations as to how he ran his presidential campaign and how he ran his business.
There we go. There's a very good sketch of all that's been going on in the Times. Well worth reading. The case of the president, the porn star, and a man called David Pecker.
Donald Trump is facing accusations that he's breached a gagging order 10 times at his criminal trial over a hush money payment to the porn star Stormy Daniels. The former president is facing 34 felony charges related to a $130,000 payment that his former lawyer and fixer Michael Cohen made to Daniels to prevent her claims of a sexual encounter with Trump from becoming public. This was in the final days of the 2016 presidential race. Today, David Pecker, former publisher of the tabloid National Enquirer, told the court of a so-called catch and kill strategy where damaging news was bought and buried ahead of that election. Let's talk to Frank Bowman, author of High Crimes and Misdemeanors, A History of Impeachment for the Age of Trump. Good evening, Frank.
Thanks for having me.
Well, tell us what we've been hearing in court today.
Of course, the first thing was an extended hearing on whether or not Mr. Trump had violated the gag order that had been placed on him by the judge. The judge did not decide that question after hearing considerable evidence. He's taken it under advisement, and one would expect to hear something about that perhaps tomorrow. From the judge's perspective, this is tricky because he senses, I think correctly, that Trump would not love nothing better than to play the victim if the judge feels obliged to come down on him very hard and even perhaps put him in jail for a few days for violating the order. On the other hand, the judge doesn't want this nonsense to continue, so he's got to design a penalty for Trump that somehow goes down the middle.
And Donald Trump, although he's been silent in court, on his way in and his way out, wastes no opportunity to lay into the court, the judge, claiming it's all a political fix. They're all against it.
Sure. He has tried to make this trial into his political stage. He can't be out campaigning because he's required to be here like any other criminal defendant. So he's trying to use the opportunity on the courthouse steps, so to speak, to make his case to the public. Whether that's successful, we will see. My sense is that he is being somewhat diminished by his association with this trial.
Yeah, I mean, he's facing some very serious charges, isn't he? That he tried to cover up the hush money payment to Stormy Daniels, the former porn star. And of course, this was all about trying to make sure that he didn't lose the election.
That's certainly the prosecution's case. What I think is in some ways most interesting about the testimony we've heard so far is the really extraordinary character of the arrangement between the National Enquirer and Mr. Trump. Not only did the Enquirer, apparently, according to its former publisher, purportedly a former friend of Mr. Trump's, not only did the Enquirer engage in catch and kill arrangements for Stormy Daniels and another woman who had an affair with Trump. But it appears from the testimony today that they had a long-running arrangement where, pursuant to instructions or suggestions given by Mr. Cohen or other emissaries of Trump, they were running bad stories, some of them apparently flagrantly false, about Trump's political opponents. That's pretty remarkable stuff. And it is to some extent perhaps a little bit lost in the fact that this is a criminal case.
Yeah, and of course the prosecution claimed that ultimately the goal in all of this was trying to fix that 2016 election. Now, we've seen Donald Trump throughout this court case, and of course he's embroiled in so many other legal proceedings as well. And it doesn't seem so far to have dented his overall standing in the polls. But do you think that what we're hearing at this trial, and indeed, of course, the fact that he's being kept off the campaign trail and will be for many more weeks yet to come, that is going to prove damaging in his run for the White House?
I would be reluctant to predict because he's defied so many similar predictions in the past. But as I said a moment ago, I do think that placing him in this setting, in a courthouse setting where he is a criminal defendant, he is not in control. And when he tries to get out of hand, he is slapped down summarily by the judge. He's in these rather grubby courtroom surroundings where he's not in control, where he is plainly subordinate to the judge, and where an awful lot of horrible things are being said about his behavior over the years. Is it going to make the kind of dramatic difference it would make for anybody else? I don't know. I doubt it. So much of what we think about Trump is baked in. But there's stuff I heard today that even I didn't know, and I've been a student of Mr. Trump's political career now for quite some time. So who knows? I think it may have some effect, but if so, it would be gradual.
And we've got a long way to go in this trial, and some very important witnesses still to come, including, of course, Stormy Daniels herself and others, which are going to carry on just capturing the headlines. I mean, not just in the United States, I should say, but here in the UK as well.
Yes, and those witnesses, of course, are going to have their own difficulties. You know, obviously one of them's a porn star who essentially accepted money to keep her mouth shut. And another one's, Michael Cohen, his former lawyer / fixer, who has conceitedly told untruths on behalf of Mr. Trump in the past. The key in this case, if you're the prosecution, however, is to recognize that although these are very impeachable witnesses, some of them, there's an awful lot of documentary material that can establish that what they're saying is true. And in Cohen's case, there's supposedly even a tape recording of Cohen talking to Trump at the White House about some of these transactions. So yes, there's much to be seen and heard. And again, my prediction would be that this is gradually going to erode at least some of his support.
Really good to speak to you. Frank Bowman, author of High Crimes and Misdemeanors, A History of Impeachment for the Age of Trump. Really good to have you on the program tonight. Thank you so much for joining us.
I think it's more a victory within the Republican Party for the Reaganite wing that believes that a strong American presence in the world is necessary for our own security and safety. You know, this bill could have been passed several months ago, but for Donald Trump's intervention, because one part of a large compromise had been worked out on the Republican side involved money for the Mexican border to prevent illegal immigration. Trump blew it up because he wanted immigration to be an issue. He didn't want it to be resolved, at least for a period of time, because of that legislation. And that blew the whole package up. And in fact, many of the Republicans, sadly, who voted against aid for Ukraine in particular, are doing it to placate Trump. Their argument is we should pay more attention to the Ukrainian border than we should pay more attention to the Mexican border than the Ukrainian border, which, of course, is a total non sequitur. But it's not that they're against aid to Ukraine. They're against Donald Trump interfering with their reelection. So we've gotten past that. The Speaker of the House, Michael Johnson, despite the time it's taken, really showed great courage here in confronting the small, hard core of Trump supporters who oppose Ukrainian aid at the risk of his job. He's still not past that risk. We'll see next week. But I think I hope this is a turning point within the Republican Party, notwithstanding we still have a presidential election in November, but some separation from Donald Trump and his erratic way of doing domestic and foreign policy.
It's interesting, Ambassador, because I was kind of tracking this back and considering that the visit of UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron. To what extent do you think this development, this progress, is as a result of Lord Cameron's visit, his conversation with Donald Trump, and perhaps the Foreign Secretary nudging Trump in the direction of getting Republicans to back the bill finally?
Well, I think it possibly had an effect, particularly if he told Trump or gave some indication that Prime Minister Sunak was going to announce a 75 billion pound increase in the UK defense budget over the next several years to bring the UK to 2.5% of GDP and to be really the largest, clearly the largest military power in Europe. That is, I think, a very, very courageous decision by the UK government, and I think that that would get even Trump's attention. I think the bigger factor is that Trump doesn't want a fight in the House of Representatives over the speakership. Why? Because it detracts attention from Donald Trump. And after all, what's the most important thing in the world? So he knew Johnson wanted to push for the Ukraine aid. He softened his opposition. As I say, we're not completely done with this kabuki theater in the House of Representatives, but I think it was more because Trump had more important things on his mind, namely Donald Trump.
That's interesting, as per usual. But perhaps it's
right.
perhaps it's a kind of, the pieces of the jigsaw were kind of put together. The Lord Cameron visit, a bit of Trump self-interest.
Look, I have to say, I have to say, I was glad that the Foreign Secretary made that trip, and it could well have been more important than you can see from the outside. So, congratulations all around.
Yeah, very interesting there. In terms of comments this week, then, from Prime Minister Sunak, also NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Stoltenberg said it's in the interest of the United States to keep NATO, and therefore I believe they will remain a staunch and loyal ally. You've worked closely with President Trump. We, of course, remember the comments he made in February saying that he would let Russia do whatever the hell they want to NATO members who didn't reach 2% of GDP by way of a NATO spending target. Can we read into this a decision, a mind change, a mind shift from Donald Trump, or would that be overinterpreting what may be going on here?
Yeah, that would be an overinterpretation. I mean, Stoltenberg is obviously correct. It would be a catastrophic mistake for the United States to drop out of NATO. But Donald Trump doesn't see it that way, nor do many of his close advisors, because they don't fundamentally understand what an alliance is all about. They view the circumstance, and similarly, they view our alliances with Japan, South Korea, and others as we're defending these countries, and they're not paying for it. And since we're just doing this out of the goodness of our hearts anyway, who needs these alliances? This is deeply ingrained in Trump, and people are desperate to find reasons to think Trump won't withdraw if he's elected. And I sincerely hope if he is, his advisors find 4 years of ways of distracting his attention so he doesn't withdraw. But make no mistake, on Trump's mind, that's his objective. He may or may not get there, but that's what he'd really want to do because he's tired of Europeans, basically.
When we turn to the US action this week, then back to President Biden, he's been signing the aid bill, really the wartime assistance, I suppose, is a better way of putting it, into law today. So $61 billion worth of aid to Ukraine, $30 billion going elsewhere, $26 billion to Israel, for example. Biden said in signing it in, he said, this vote makes it clear there's a bipartisan consensus for this kind of leadership, i.e. intervention in global affairs. And this idea, Ambassador, that he was getting at, that the US doesn't watch global events, it shapes global events. First of all, do you agree with that as a premise? Is that true?
Well, I don't think Biden is a particularly good example of effective American leadership. I would say, in fact, part of the opposition to the aid to Ukraine is we're now, sadly, more than 2 years into the war after Russia's unprovoked aggression. And where are we? We're at gridlock with Russia roughly having doubled the territory in Ukraine under its control compared to what it had after the first invasion in 2014. And we're at that point because of the non-strategic way that the U.S. and NATO as a whole have distributed the aid. We have long arguments. Do we give them ATACMS? Do we give them Abrams tanks? Do we give them F-16s? And at the end of the day, yeah, the decision comes in the right way, but it's not, the assistance is not being provided strategically. We haven't given Ukraine what it really needs to prevail over the Russians, in large part because Joe Biden is intimidated and deterred by Moscow. He frets endlessly about a wider war, as if the real objective here is not to help Ukraine win, which is the stated objective of NATO, the full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, but to prevent Ukraine from losing, and which is where we are now. So a lot of people are dissatisfied. My argument is, look, you can't let the incompetence of the president get in the way of providing for American national security. It just means it's going to cost a lot more, which is what the problem is.
I also wanted to ask you about China and China's response to this, because in the bill is $8 billion to counter Chinese threats in Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific, which I noted China's response protesting against these funds for this military assistance to Taiwan. What do you make of that in terms of, is this a provocative move? Is this provoking China in some way, or is this simply going to descend into a war of words?
Well, I don't think defense is provocative. Look, I would recognize Taiwan as an independent nation, which it is functionally. The amount of assistance is really quite small compared to the threat that China poses. But I would call your attention to another piece of this relatively complex legislation that was passed by the House and then by the Senate last night, and that is a provision that requires that the Chinese owner of TikTok divest itself of TikTok if it's going to remain in the United States. Now, I would have gone further, but this is let's look at what TikTok is. It's an instrument of the Chinese state. It's intended to influence opinion in America, and it's intended to vacuum up information about TikTok users, going back into the huge collection of information China has hacked out of our internet storage facilities over the past several years. The provocative action here is from companies like Huawei and ZTE, which are trying to take control of fifth generation telecommunications. TikTok, which is like the Pied Piper of Hamelin with our young people. There's a lot more going on besides. This is China's effort here is not just in the traditional politico-military sphere, but it's really whole of society, economics, and everything else. So that's something I think that in Europe as a whole, there needs to be a lot more discussion with NATO partners about this threat from China, manifested through what I see increasingly as a Beijing-Moscow axis.
So it was a consequential hearing today, and for nearly 3 hours, the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington weighed whether former presidents are immune from prosecution and what exactly it means if they are. Its answer will determine whether former President Donald Trump can be tried on charges of trying to subvert the 2020 election. Whatever the decision, each justice indicated that it would shape US democracy for years to come. So let's talk about this now with David K. Johnston, investigative journalist and author of It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America, and The Making of Donald Trump. David, hello again.
Great to be with you again, Henry.
All right, so let's start off where we should. Justice Neil Gorsuch, appointed by Trump, when he said, "Are you not entertained?" when he unveiled him, said, okay, we're writing a rule for the ages. So what does that mean, would you say?
Well, the issue here is Donald Trump's claim that as president of the United States, he has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution. This is an extraordinary claim for many reasons, not the least of which is that the presidential oath says you're to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. And Trump's lawyers have actually argued that the president could order the military to kill his political opponent and presumably anybody else. They would be liable for following an illegal order of the president and could be prosecuted. But Trump's lawyers assert that president must have this absolute immunity from criminal conduct, or he can't be president. No previous president, by the way, has made this assertion, and the current president, Joe Biden, has mocked it.
Right. And what about the response of the 9 justices, including those appointed by Trump? How did they react to the arguments put forward by Trump's lawyers?
This was a just very bizarre 3-hour hearing today, Henry. The court's majority, the conservative majority, seemed to be asking about, well, are there certain areas of law where the president could commit crimes and he would be exempted and would have immunity from this? Not, why are we talking about this? Of course, the president of the United States is subject to the law. I think that the majority of the justices are trying to find a way to send this back to the trial court so that it will delay the proceedings so that Trump can't be tried until after the election. And I realize I'm saying that they're being blatantly political, but from watching and reading news accounts today, I can tell you that I'm far from alone in interpreting it that way.
Don't presidents already have a degree of immunity anyway? So, for example, people have tried to or have suggested that George W. Bush be prosecuted for an illegal war in Iraq, or Barack Obama should be prosecuted for being the drone president. But those claims, those attempts never got off the ground because he was commander-in-chief and he was in a war situation, and it was part and parcel of his official duties, no matter how appalling you might have thought the outcome.
Yes. And so much of the discussion today by the court was, well, where is the line between official duties and personal or campaign duties? And in the transfer of power to a new president under the U.S. Constitution, the president has no role whatsoever. None. It is the vice president who presides during the joint session of the Senate and the House. And this issue was only brought up by the newest member of the court, Ketanji Brown Jackson, who, as in every previous hearing I've listened to, went right to the heart of the issue and, basically said, why are we discussing this stuff over here about which crimes the president can commit?
Yes.
And got right to the heart. She's clearly the most brilliant legal scholar. And, I also teach law, and that's what I have told my law school students, that she's outstanding, even in comparison to the other Supreme Court justices.
Well, it's amazing you say, I say not amazing, but it's good. It's interesting you say that, because I remember at the time of her hearings and confirmation hearings, some of the senators were trying to give the impression that she was some kind of diversity and inclusion pick.
Yes. Well, there's no shortage of racism in America. And of course, Donald Trump's campaign, and I've covered him for 36 years, known him for those years, Make America Great Again is seen by many people as a campaign to make America white again.
Yeah. Well. And it'll be interesting to see how Americans respond to the 2.0 version of this, assuming Trump is eventually the nominee come November, which everyone expects him to be. So there was a 3-hour hearing today. What happens next?
Well, the court now will come up with an opinion. You can be virtually certain there'll be a divided court. My guess is it'll be 5-4 or 6-3. And there will probably be several concurring and dissenting separate opinions. But fundamentally, I expect that the Supreme Court will say, well, there's all these unresolved issues, and they'll send it back to the district court. That guarantees that Trump will not be tried on his effort to overthrow the government on January 6th until after the election on November 5.
Okay, but what about what's happening in New York then? A different trial, and one which Trump is being forced to attend every day, and he looks furious.
He is very upset. I don't see how Donald will get through another 5 or 6 weeks of this, having to sit in the chair and be quiet. Today, David Pecker, who was the publisher of a tabloid called The National Enquirer that's infamous for nonsense stuff. Aliens from Mars are the father of
I
some
remember, I've
movie
seen a few
star's
copies
baby.
in my time, David. I've seen a few
Yes,
copies in my time.
And he laid out how for decades he has engaged with politicians and movie stars, Governor Schwarzenegger in California when he was an actor, to catch and kill. That is, pay people to buy the rights to their story and then not publish them. And at that point, the person can't talk about something. And talked about how he did this for Trump, how he knew it was for Trump. And what was significant in the testimony is Donald's story is, well, I did this to keep it from my wife, Melania. David Pecker, who said, I'm still his friend, said under oath that, no, that was never discussed. What he talked about was influencing the election. That's the charge against Trump, that you paid hush money to two women, a porn star and a Playboy model, to keep their mouths shut, and you did so in an effort to corrupt the election and violate New York state law that says you can't do that.
Wow. Does David Pecker put himself in any legal jeopardy by being so candid? I.e., yes, he said he wanted to influence the election, and I said, okay, I'll help you.
Yes, although he has federal immunity, so he can't be prosecuted on the federal level. And I think it's very clear that the local prosecutor, the district attorney in Manhattan, is not going to charge him. And since the crimes occurred in Manhattan, I don't think David Pecker is in any legal jeopardy so long as he tells the truth.
Yeah. And what about other big witnesses coming down the track? I'm presuming Michael Cohen will be up soon.
Michael Cohen will be a witness, and there's been a lot made in the press that, well, Michael Cohen, is a liar. Michael Cohen went to prison for the exact same crime being charged here, and his job was to lie on behalf of Donald Trump. Once Trump turned on him, and it was the Trump administration that prosecuted him, he has been completely candid and straightforward. In his conversations with me, every fact he's given out has held up when I go check it, because it's in his interest now to tell the truth. And, prosecutors put on professional killers as witnesses and people who committed numerous crimes. Everybody lies. Any parent who's had a 4-year-old who goes, Daddy, is Santa Claus real? You're lying. And so I don't think they'll have trouble rehabilitating him. But with Pecker as a witness and the documents, Trump really doesn't have any defenses here. The only thing his lawyers can do is try to muddy what are pretty clear waters and hope that the jury may say, yeah, it's not that big a deal, and they could decide to engage in nullification. Yeah, he did it, but we don't think it's important. Don't think that's likely with a jury in Manhattan, but you don't know until the jury comes back.
Yeah. And finally, David, the more Trump gets indicted, the more his poll rating and his resources, the funds, go up. But if he is convicted, what impact might that have on floating voters, on independents, on people who think, I don't want a convicted felon to be the nominee, let alone the president of the United States?
So, Henry, the most recent polling shows he's heading down, not up. I also don't think the polls are particularly reliable because fewer than 1 in 100 people who answer the phone will answer the questions. I was the first person in America to point out, I was on national TV, that a man who is a convicted felon serving time in prison can be president of the United States. And the person on the air with me thought that was nuts, but within 2 days, everybody was saying that. and everybody now understands that. A conviction will cause a great rapid drop in support for Trump. That's the one thing we found in numerous polls going back a couple of years, that people will put up with a lot of things, but if you're a convicted felon, they don't want you to be president of the United States. Joe Biden will win the popular vote, and I believe he'll win this fall by more than 10 million votes. But that does not mean he becomes president, because in America, we elect by state, and Trump only needs to win 6 states that could go either way to go back into the White House, where he promises that on day one he'll be dictator. And if you believe he'll give up his being a dictator the next day, as he claims, well, I got a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you.
I'm not buying, David. Caveat emptor. Thank you very much indeed. That's David K. Johnson, investigative journalist and author of It's Even Worse Than You Think, what the Trump administration is doing to America.
It's 6 minutes past 6. Now, Donald Trump's hush money trial rumbles on in New York, and we'll come to that in a moment. But he has won a partial victory in one of the other legal cases that he's fighting. Supreme Court justices have delayed a potential decision after some of them seem to accept he may have some level of immunity over the 2020 riots. Sarah Baxter is director of the Mary Colvin Centre for International Reporting in New York.
They're examining whether Donald Trump can have absolute immunity from prosecution as President of the United States, i.e. for anything he did while he was in office. Now, that would seriously impact the case that's being brought against him by Special Counsel Jack Smith concerning the events of January the 6th at the Capitol, the riot or insurrection, as plenty call it, and the scheme to install fake electors to stop certifying Joe Biden's election victory in Congress. So basically, it would mean that he could mount a coup against the elected government of the United States and be declared immune because he was president.
Gosh, so I mean, it begs the question. I mean, other countries must have thought about this. There must be protections in place currently to stop, for example, a president coming to the end of the term in office and then being accused of a war crime for going to war to protect the United States, for example. There must be some protection in place for this already.
Well, you see, you've hit on a sensitive point here because the thing is, if you give a president absolute immunity, he can do what he likes in office. He can kill his rivals. He can do anything. I mean, as a matter of fact, his own lawyer suggested that that might be permissible because, you know, it would be up to Congress, for example, to impeach and convict him, not up to a court. You'd have this absolute immunity. But what if, say, he did order the assassination of a hostile foreign leader? You're not supposed to do that, of course, but say there was an imminent threat to the US and he took an executive decision that could come back to haunt him legally, even though he was doing it as president to safeguard the interests of the American people. Now, that's where you get into a sort of grey area that conservative judges are seizing on. We don't know yet what their verdict will be. In fact, we might not know for a while yet. But from the tenor of the questionings, it seems very likely now that they're making a distinction between things that a president might do as a personal act, for example, try and kill off a rival, and things that a president might do as a presidential act. So the big takeaway today is that chances of Donald Trump being tried for what happened on January 6th, never that bright, before the next election, are now almost entirely sunk. And that's why it's a very good day for Donald Trump. His people are acting as if they should be celebrating already because they don't think that this case is going to come to court before the next election.
Gosh, so huge implications. I'm just reading here some incredible questions from some of the justices. Justice Jackson, who's a Liberal justice, saying, I'm trying to understand what the disincentive is from turning the Oval Office into a seat of criminality. I mean, you can see the kind of the arguments that are being played out. And this, obviously, as you say, is beneficial to Donald Trump, but this has huge implications for future presidents of the United States as well.
Yes, well, one of the things about the founding fathers is they never really expected the president of the United States to be engaged in criminal behavior. So they didn't actually rule on this. So if the Supreme Court comes to a ruling about a distinction between presidential immunity and political immunity, that is, as one of the justices said, a decision for the ages. They are making history, and therefore they're going to take their time deliberating about this because it has to stand the test of time. Donald Trump's made it pretty clear that if he does get elected president, he wants to do to Joe Biden what he feels Joe Biden has done to him and start launching prosecutions. You know, we know that he's chanted before, lock her up, with regard to Hillary Clinton. And it now looks like there's genuine concern that more or less anybody who enters high office as a president is going to be subject to persecution and political prosecution by their enemies or rivals. And that's why the Supreme Court is now trying to walk on eggshells about this. I mean, it would be far simpler, of course, if they just said, oh, of course, a president is not immune for criminal acts. But now they're worried about what defines criminality. And as I say, it comes back to this question of, did a president undertake something in America's interests acting as a president? Or did he undertake something in his personal interest acting as just an ordinary person with extreme powers? So this is I don't know. I think it's going to be tremendously difficult. I mean, I almost feel like they could end up dancing on the head of a pin.
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating stuff. We mustn't forget, of course, that Donald Trump is also facing another criminal trial at the moment, the hush money trial. Just bring us up to date with the latest in that.
Yes, well, this didn't go quite so well for Donald Trump today. This is the case brought against him by Alvin Bragg in New York regarding hush money payments to porn star Stormy Daniels. There's no question that she received payments, but the question is, was it a criminal enterprise? And involving Donald Trump. Now, some of the evidence given in court today was from David Pecker, who was the owner of the National Enquirer, who basically promised to have Trump's back in the run-up to the 2016 election, and was promised to be his eyes and ears and to quote unquote catch and kill any negative stories about Donald Trump. Now, one of the negative stories that he paid for was this allegation by a Playboy model called Karen McDougal that that she'd had a 10-month affair, allegedly, with Donald Trump. Now, the National Enquirer paid her $150,000 effectively to silence her, i.e. they owned her story and they didn't publish it. Now, the interesting thing is that only days before Trump was due to take office as president, that is after he had won the 2016 election and various alleged facts like Karen McDougal's story had not come out, Donald Trump had a meeting with David Pecker. Actually, was sort of thanking him. He said he literally, according to Pecker, said, "I want to thank you for handling the McDougal situation," which draws a direct level of responsibility between the National Enquirer and Donald Trump, as opposed to middlemen that he could say that he knew nothing about. So. And apparently, Donald Trump also asked after Karen McDougal, "How's our girl?" And David Pecker replied, "She's cool. She's very quiet. No issues." So that's pretty revealing testimony, I think, from the former National Enquirer owner.
Sarah Baxter there, who's director of the Mary Colvin Centre for International Reporting in New York. Talking about just two of the trials which Donald Trump is facing.
Yeah, there's plenty more to come. And of course, that's all in the build-up to the US presidential election. This is the election station. And so that important context on Donald Trump and all that happens over the next few months.